3 days later, Turan and his party steered the ship toward the island where their operation was planned. Perhaps due to the storm brought by the Great Sea Serpent, the sky was always covered in dark clouds, keeping the world dim with strong winds blowing and high waves crashing. Theirs was the only ship sailing in the area. No spectators to witness the small fishing boat gliding over the sea.
So, this is how humans with the power of devils steer their ships. It's as fast as some merfolk swimming.
Rowena, the mermaid princess who had boarded with them, murmured her impression. Armenia, the young merfolk Turan had rescued, stood beside her and nodded.
It's much faster than when I was with him before. It wasn't like this back then.
Well, this time, 3 people are steering it. The mackerel is all grilled. Do you want some?
Thanks.
After grilling and eating the mackerel they had caught using fluid manipulation magic, Armenia transformed into a baby shark and leapt into the sea, saying he would inform his family of Turan's arrival in advance. When Turan focused the sacred relic's senses toward the ocean, he could feel a small presence rapidly moving away underwater.
Despite what you said earlier, he swims much faster.
Well, he is a shark after all. That's something to be envious of, being able to swim fast.
Rowena sighed as she watched Armenia disappear. According to the conversation that had come up during their chatter, she could take the form of a crab, which allowed her to move freely on land, but made her slower in the water compared to her kin. Because of that, in the upcoming battle she planned to fight alongside Turan's party on land. Misa, one of Turan's companions, looked at Rowena and asked,
By the way, how do you guys determine which creatures you can transform into? Are you just born with it?
It's similar. We can influence it to some extent, but there's a natural predisposition. If I really wanted to, I could have transformed into a slightly different type of crab, but it wouldn't have made much of a difference.
In ancient times, there were royal family members who could take the form of a great sea serpent, but that was just an old legend. Nowadays, royal merfolk who could transform into large creatures like sharks or whales like Armenia were considered to have high potential. Although he was still young, Armenia was seen as someone with promising potential among the merfolk.
If someone like him went missing, it must have caused quite a commotion.
Rowena paused.
Well, it wasn't that much of a fuss. We just figured he'd come back on his own.
When Turan subtly brought up the topic to emphasize his achievement in rescuing Armenia, Rowena had downplayed it as though it were no big deal. Even though they had agreed to cooperate, her attitude showed she wasn't willing to concede an inch, making Turan chuckle. He turned his gaze toward the northern horizon, where the island was slowly coming into view.
The promise you made earlier was kept, right?
Of course. Other than the royal family members participating in the fight and a few noble class attendants to serve them, no one else will be there. Honestly, managing the lower class merfolk is exhausting for us too.
This was one of the conditions Turan had demanded from the merfolk. The lower-class merfolk would be of no help in the hunt for the great sea serpent and would likely become a burden, so he had insisted they be left behind. This was to maintain balance between their forces and the merfolk. No matter how powerful the wizards in Turan's group were, if thousands of merfolk swarmed them while they were fighting the royal family, they would inevitably suffer losses in both magic power and stamina.
But what about you? Are you planning to bring that bird into battle? It looks like it could be in danger.
This one is tougher than she looks, so it'll be fine.
As Turan stroked her head, BJ, his bird companion, closed her eyes and enjoyed it, then glanced at Rowena with a mocking expression, as if to say, "How dare someone like you judge my worth?" In the first place, the reason Turan had even considered attempting the hunt for the great sea serpent was because of BJ. No matter how formidable the enemy, having wings that could detect danger early and carry them to safety made a tremendous difference. Before landing on the island, Turan activated tracking magic and scooped up a handful of seawater to sniff it. Good at the very least. It didn't seem like there were a large number of merfolk. At most, he estimated a dozen or so. The destination island was not particularly large. By the time they landed, activating the sense of the sacred relic allowed him to encompass the entire island within his detection range. There were 2 merfolk comparable to upper and mid-tier human nobles, one slightly weaker than them, and 6 merfolk of upper to mid-tier strength. Lastly, there were lower-ranked merfolk among them, likely including Armenia, making a total of 9 royal merfolk. Including Rowena, who was with them, that made 10. Additionally, there were about 10 other merfolk present, far weaker than the royals. These were likely noble-class merfolk, who, like Armenia when they first met, possessed only a level of power similar to ordinary humans. They had probably come to serve as attendants. Using wind magic, Turan discreetly relayed this information to Solif and Misa. Misa's expression turned thoughtful.
10 royal merfolk.
She said quietly through the spell.
That kid can't really be counted as a combatant, so 9. If we end up fighting, do you think we can handle it?
Easily.
Turan replied.
Merfolk are generally stronger than nobles of the same rank, but the same applies to us. However, what's important to remember is that we must never appear weaker than them during or after the battle.
The most crucial aspect of this fight was to never forget that the merfolk were unreliable allies. If they expended too much power hunting the Great Sea Serpent and their combat strength dropped significantly, they had to be prepared for the possibility of an ambush.
We've arrived. Let's disembark.
While they had been whispering among themselves, the ship had reached the island. Turan's group disembarked with Rowena and headed inland. Since the island was not very large, it only took a few minutes to reach where the royal merfolk were gathered.
Oh, are those the humans?
One of them said.
They all look pretty young. Are they really that strong?
Said another. A third shrugged.
Well, Sister Rowena must have judged them properly.
Contrary to expectations, the royal merfolk they encountered all spoke in a casual and somewhat rough manner. Turan had expected more formal speech, like Armenia or Rowena, who used a somewhat rigid style, but perhaps those two had simply learned an unusual way of speaking. Among the group dressed in clothes seemingly made from seaweed, Armenia, notably smaller in stature, stepped forward to greet Turan.
That grey-haired one is Turan, the kind devil who saved me. He's really strong. He beat Sister Rowena so easily she couldn't even fight back.
Rowena's lips twisted into a forced smile, her pride clearly wounded, but she did not argue. After all, it was true that she had been thoroughly beaten. The royal merfolk, hearing Armenia's words, looked at Turan's group with even greater interest.
Oh.
One breathed.
She lost that badly?
Said another. A third nodded with apparent approval.
If he's that strong, he must be one of the most powerful devils on land. Kid, you got lucky.
As they chatted among themselves, Turan's gaze shifted to a merfolk noble standing politely behind the royals. The noble was staring at Turan's group while drooling. Turan blinked.
Hey, Yakin, I told you to control yourself. You're being disgraceful.
Yakon, the noble class attendant, quickly wiped away the drool and bowed his head.
My apologies, Your Highness.
Turan had heard that noble class merfolk, while not as disciplined as the royals, still had a considerable degree of self-control. Seeing this, he had his doubts. If even a noble was this undisciplined, he could only imagine how little restraint the lower-class merfolk must have. He narrowed his eyes, watching the merfolk chatter excitedly among themselves. If only he could read these creatures' emotions too. Though he didn't fully understand the mechanism behind it, Turan had the ability to perceive human emotions to some extent through scent, an ability that extended even to most ordinary animals. But merfolk were an exception. Whether it was the fishy smell they exuded or something else entirely, he couldn't say. Just then, Rowena removed the human clothing she had been wearing and donned the seaweed garments typical of merfolk.
Then let's start by introducing ourselves.
She said.
I am Turan. These two are Sol and Misha. Pleased to meet you.
He offered nothing more. One of the merfolk looked puzzled.
That's it? Don't you humans have house names or something?
There are some among us who wander without such things.
The merfolk exchanged curious looks, but since none of them seemed particularly knowledgeable on the subject, they shrugged it off and accepted it. Following that, the merfolk introduced themselves, and to Turan's surprise, they were all children of the current merfolk king. One older brother of Rowena, 4 younger brothers, and 3 younger sisters, including Armenia. That made a total of 9. As he listened, Turan immediately raised a question.
What about other relatives?
One of the merfolk tilted their head.
What do you mean?
I mean, your father, the merfolk king, must have siblings as well. Do they not have children?
Judging by the numbers, it seemed the royal merfolk did not lack for reproduction. If the offspring of other royal lineages were included, their overall strength would rival that of a major noble house. One of the merfolk responded as if the answer were obvious.
Of course, they're all dead.
How did that happen?
We sent them off ourselves. A kingdom has only one king, and only his bloodline may thrive.
When a king was replaced, all royal descendants outside the new king's direct lineage were purged. The young royal merfolk recounted this with complete indifference, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Turan glanced at Solif and Myza. Their expressions showed they were equally appalled.
Is this normal?
Yes, the merfolk of other kingdoms do the same.
Don't say unnecessary things, Kolova.
Rowena cut off the talkative royal with a sharp look, as if in warning. So there was more than one merfolk kingdom. That was news to Turan. Well, it made sense. Other races weren't all united under a single rule either. Aside from the necromancer king that Myza had once hunted down, there were likely still dark elf clans thriving somewhere underground, and some dwarven groups surviving in the gray zone. It would have been a mistake to assume the merfolk were a singular, unified faction. But learning this reminded him of something. Perhaps this was not even the merfolk kingdom that Ymir had once mentioned, the one supposedly working with the lawyer. If that were the case, then they had been off track from the beginning. Suppressing his doubts, Turan turned to Kolova and asked another question.
Did you consider asking for help from other kingdoms?
Kolova shrugged.
Then we wouldn't get to keep all the corpse to ourselves. That's the whole reason we're doing this.
Kolova.
Rowena's older brother, the eldest son of the merfolk king, sharply reprimanded him. But by then, Turan had already heard everything he needed. Just then, the 10th merfolk presence he had sensed stepped out from behind the thicket. The sudden tension in the air made Armenia shrink back. Then he straightened and beamed.
Oh, Abamama, you look like you had a good shit.
Quiet, you little brat.
The speaker, growling in irritation, was a middle-aged merfolk with white hair and a beard that reached his navel. Unlike the countless storybook depictions, he wore no golden crown or pearl necklace, but the sharp glint in his eyes and the deep wrinkles etched into his face radiated authority, making it clear he stood a step above all the others. Most striking was the trident he held like a staff. Judging by the immense flow of magic within it, it was no ordinary artifact. A sacred relic, a top-tier one at that. The merfolk king, wielding a treasure Turan judged to be equal to or greater than his own mimic relic, calmly observed Turan's group, then spoke with a displeased expression.
Young wizards. Barely 60 years old, even if I'm being generous.
Skill doesn't necessarily follow age.
Turan deliberately spoke in an informal tone, asserting himself as an equal. He instinctively knew that the moment he showed deference, the king would regard him as an inferior entirely. As expected, the merfolk king only twitched his brow at Turan's casual speech and did not openly express anger. He scoffed.
Arrogant brats.
Then he sat down on a large stone chair, looking down on them with an air of arrogance. Facing him directly, Turan spoke first.
More importantly, I think the deal needs to be adjusted a bit.
What deal are you talking about?
The corpse of the great sea serpent. Rowena said clearly it was worthless, but from what I see now, that's not the case.
Who said something like that?
As the merfolk king turned his head, all of his children looked toward Kolova.
If you're not even seeking help from other merfolk kingdoms, and trying to keep the whole thing for yourselves, then it must be quite valuable, right?
Turan locked eyes with the merfolk king's deep reddish-brown gaze. After about 10 seconds of silent staring, the king shook his head in exasperation.
Humans. Always so greedy. So, what do you want? Do you want me to split the great sea serpent's corpse in half with you? Or would a chest of pearls do?
You mean the stuff that comes from clams?
One of the younger merfolk chimed in.
I don't know why, but I hear humans really like them.
Stay quiet when father is speaking, you fools.
At the eldest son's shout, the royal merfolk who had been murmuring in the background flinched and lowered their heads. Seeing this, Turan could somewhat understand why the merfolk king favored Rowena.
It's nothing too grand,
Turan said.
I'd just like to hear a few stories about the surface world.
From what he had seen, none of the royal merfolk possessed any noteworthy magic artifacts, likely because in their transformed aquatic forms, handling objects was difficult. The only real treasure among them was that trident, but if he asked for that, the hunt for the great sea serpent would undoubtedly fall apart. In other words, the most reasonable compensation Turan could demand was information. The merfolk king stared at him.
That's all you want?
Of course.
What kind of stories?
The lawyer.
The merfolk king narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing him, but before long he gave a slight nod.
Fine. We'll talk alone. You lot, go find something else to do away from here.
But I'm curious about the human stories.
One of the merfolk protested.
Me too,
said another.
Get lost, now.
At the king's roar, the grumbling royal merfolk scattered one by one. Seeing this, Turan signaled Solif and Myza to step aside as well. Once they were alone, the merfolk king quietly asked,
Where did you hear that name?
From Ymir.
Since they were already on opposing sides, Turan used the name freely. The merfolk king tilted his head slightly.
I don't know that name.
If he didn't know Ymir, that meant he wasn't an active participant in the gods' power struggles, at best merely aware of some of their dealings. In fact, the very fact that the lawyer's alias was used even among allies suggested he wasn't fully committed to the relationship.
Are you working with the lawyer?
I don't know if you'd call it cooperation, but we've maintained ties for generations. That side holds our leash, after all.
From his tone and expression, it was evident he held no personal goodwill toward the lawyer. If anything, there was a trace of hostility. Even so, the reason they continued to follow the lawyer was that he had a way to exert pressure on the merfolk kingdom. The king had no intention of explaining exactly how. Is he ruling over multiple merfolk kingdoms? If that were the case, it would explain how the lawyer as a single entity could stand against multiple powerful foes. Having 4 or 5 merfolk forces of this scale would be enough to utterly crush a major noble house, and if his domain spanned both seas, then his influence would be far greater than that. At that moment, the merfolk king fixed Turan with a sharp gaze.
Are you one of those monstrous beings as well? One who lives an eternal life?
Even if I don't answer, you seem to already know.
The king let out a low, humorless sound.
I should have realized it when I saw how absurdly strong such young humans were. What kind of tricks are you planning this time?
I genuinely intend to hunt the great sea serpent, so there's nothing to worry about, unless you try something suspicious on your end.
At Turan's words, the merfolk king shook his head with an exasperated expression.
Killing you here would be pointless. You'd just come back to life someday and seek revenge. I have no intention of gifting my people an eternal enemy.
A fortunate thing for both of us.
If the merfolk king mistook Turan, and by extension, the other two, for members of the Priya god tribe, then there could be no better deterrent against betrayal. After all, only a fool would make an enemy of someone who returned even from death. Suppressing his amusement, Turan maintained a relaxed demeanor.
So is that all you wanted to ask? Why didn't you seek the lawyer's cooperation for this? It seems like something that would interest him as well.
Turan didn't know whether God's vessels had unlimited magic power, but there was no reason to pass up an opportunity to absorb a massive amount of it. At the very least, the lawyer could have used the great sea serpent's power to strengthen his future vessels. The merfolk king responded with a perplexed expression.
Isn't that something you would know better than me? Why are you asking me?
Because I'm not the lawyer's friend.
By subtly emphasizing that he belonged to a different faction, Turan prompted the merfolk king to snort softly.
The sealing method using that sacred relic you took was suggested by him. We never mentioned hunting. If he knew, there's no way he'd let us keep the corpse.
Why not?
Instead of answering, the merfolk king widened his deep reddish-brown eyes and stared at Turan intently, weighing whether Turan was genuinely curious or merely probing him. After a brief silence, he slowly spoke.
Because it would allow us to return to being true royal merfolk once more. As priests of the great sea serpent, we could reclaim the forms we once had.
1 week remained until the great sea serpent arrived. Turan, the leader of his small group, spent that time practicing magic and discussing how to ensure success when hunting the massive monster. Rowena, a merfolk royal of exceptional strength, and Armenia, the youngest of the royal siblings, joined the others in the discussions, debating what roles they should each take.
If you can't breathe underwater and need to stay above the surface, why don't I support you? The piece of wood you came on is obviously going to be smashed to bits as soon as the real fight starts.
The one speaking was a merfolk royal who could transform into a sea turtle, with a shell length of a staggering 7 meters. Turan admired the sheer size of the creature, even larger than Rowena, who possessed far greater strength. However, his amazement was short-lived.
Can't you move any faster?
This is my max speed. If I want to go faster, I have to shrink my body.
Watching the sea turtle plod slowly forward as if weighed down by its own mass, Turan let out a small sigh. Fortunately, it was a bit faster when swimming, and even when it reduced its size, it was still large enough for 3 people to ride on. It would at least be useful for resting. Using it for quick transportation, however, would be difficult. Aside from that, the merfolk royalty displayed their ability to transform into various sea creatures, from elongated cutlass fish to squid, blue marlin, orcas, and even jellyfish. Of course, they did not merely turn into large animals. Like Rowena, each of them possessed at least one unique ability. Some could pierce through anything with their sharp snouts, release electricity from their tentacles, or emit sonic waves by roaring. As the saying goes, when something is given, something must be returned. Since the merfolk were actively demonstrating their abilities, Turan's party also revealed some of their own techniques. Turan showcased his expertise in slingshot techniques. Mesa, a sharp-eyed mage and one of Turan's companions, displayed her lightning spells, and Solif, the third member of the group, cast Light of Judgment. As the golden whip struck the waves and evaporated the water into steam, the merfolk let out awed exclamations.
I thought the power of devils was just about manipulating and freezing water, but it's more diverse than I expected.
It seemed that, aside from the wizards of House Carmine, the merfolk royalty had little experience with human magic users, making Turan's party's abilities all the more fascinating to them. Finally, when Turan demonstrated the explosion spell using the spirit of fire, one of the royal merfolk remarked,
This is similar to our mother's technique. It would have been good if she were here.
Mother?
Yes. She stayed at the palace to protect the ones who are too weak and young to be helpful. This one was brought along because there wasn't time to take him back there.
A young princess spoke as she grabbed Armania from where he clung to his older siblings and stretched his cheeks. If the merfolk queen was a powerful fighter, even if not as strong as her husband, she would have been a great help. However, it seemed they had taken precautions to ensure the complete survival of their kingdom, acting as a kind of insurance. For Turan's party, it was both a shame and a relief. If the merfolk had been stronger, the hunt would have been easier, but at the same time, they would likely hold more control over the situation.
The merfolk king is a whale, right?
That's right. He is truly incredible. He'll probably be leading the charge in battle.
Currently, the merfolk king was away from the island, having taken on the task of luring the great sea serpent to this location. Was he provoking it little by little from afar, gradually adjusting its trajectory? Though the details were not shared with Turan's party, the merfolk, having worshipped the great sea serpent for generations, clearly had extensive knowledge about it. Perhaps it had something to do with the power of that trident they possessed. After gaining some understanding of each other's abilities and discussing combat strategies, they split up to begin individual training sessions to prepare for battle in the ocean. During this time, Turan developed a few new spells, one that created a tube connecting to the surface for emergency breathing underwater, and another that manipulated the surrounding water to move his body, similar to how a boat moved. Although it was Turan who created the technique, the one who trained hardest with it was Solif, who was unable to fly due to his poor control over wind magic. He grimaced and strained against the water, fighting for every inch of movement.
Try harder. This is the most important technique for you.
Easier said than done. Do you think I'm a genius like you guys?
Turan watched him struggle and spoke in a low voice.
BJ will be paired with you, but you should also prepare for the possibility of fighting underwater, in case she gets seriously injured and can't continue.
He avoided saying that someone might die, fearing it would bring misfortune, but they all knew there was a real possibility of casualties in this battle. After all, that was the very nature of combat. The likelihood of survival varied depending on one's strength, but in the end, battle was fundamentally a fight for one's life. Moreover, this opponent was one whose full power they could not accurately predict until they faced it directly. BJ, the small bird who rode perched on Turan's head, tilted her head and stretched out a foot, scratching words into the water's surface.
Could we die?
It's fine. Just focus on carrying Solif and providing support. I'll make sure you're never in danger.
BJ scratched again.
Turan shouldn't die either. Neither should mate or servant.
Who are you calling a servant?
Solif, who had been listening, flared up in protest. BJ flapped her wings lightly and splashed water at him. Solif spat out the seawater with a disgusted expression and turned to Turan.
So, the two of you will be flying around during the fight?
Yeah. Carrying all three of us through the storm would be too much of a burden on BJ.
Misa, who had been smoothly manipulating the water to move her body, answered in Turan's place. Although she was slightly slower at mastering the technique than Turan, her talent in magical perception and control was extraordinary. Solif stroked his chin where a slight silver beard had begun to grow and spoke in a worried tone.
But is it really okay to reveal everything without holding anything back? I'm worried the word might spread.
Well, those merfolk don't seem to have much interaction with the land. Also, this is just my guess, but I think this kingdom will cut ties with House Carmine soon. After that, they won't have much reason to associate with other major noble houses either.
Given the merfolk king's displeasure toward Carmine's god, the lawyer, and his ambition to revive the power of the old royal bloodline using the great sea serpent's corpse, this was a natural conclusion. It was not surprising that those with enough power to be independent no longer wished to remain subordinate. Hearing this, Solif suddenly smacked the water with his palm and exclaimed,
Oh, that. What are we going to do about it?
About what?
The great sea serpent's corpse. You're not really going to hand it over intact, are you?
What if we don't?
The royal family might have self-control and act all friendly now, but I bet there are still people getting eaten by merfolk somewhere along the shore. I don't know if it's really a good idea to give them such immense power.
As long as they don't break our agreement, I have no intention of breaking it either. A deal is a deal.
Some of the noble-class merfolk still occasionally looked at Turan's party with a hint of hunger in their eyes, but at least the royal family showed no such signs. So Turan would treat them as intelligent beings capable of communication, people accordingly. If the other side wished to uphold their promise, it was only right to do the same. That was the golden rule. Mesa cleared her throat softly and said,
I agree. Besides, if things go as Turan says, the merfolk growing stronger would actually weaken the god's control over them, right? That's a win for us.
Outnumbered 2-1, Solif sighed and flopped onto the water, lying down in resignation. By now he had trained enough to master the technique of solidifying water beneath him like a bed.
Fine. I don't care anymore. You figure it out.
Don't worry too much. After all, once we've taken down the great sea serpent, we'll be strong enough to prevent them from using their newfound power to oppress humans.
According to the merfolk king, the great sea serpent was far weaker than it had been at its peak. However, if they managed to hunt down a creature capable of triggering such natural phenomena, they would undoubtedly gain immense power, perhaps enough to surpass top-ranking nobles and reach the level of great house family heads.
Besides, even if they gain the power to transform into the great sea serpent, it won't be an overwhelming threat. After all, only one of them will survive to become king.
When Turan brought up the merfolk's customs, Solif and Misa immediately turned their gazes toward the merfolk royalty, who were playing among themselves a short distance away. At that very moment, a young royal was pouring sand over Rowena's head, only to let out a shriek as she struck him in retaliation.
Right, now that you mention it, I really do find them fascinating.
What about them?
They're supposed to kill each other when it comes time to inherit the throne, right? So how can they be so friendly with each other?
If it were me, I wouldn't even dare to stand next to them.
Misa, still lying lazily on the water's surface, chimed in. Turan glanced at the merfolk before answering, almost as if making an excuse.
Well, I suppose their moral values are different from humans.
In truth, Turan himself had trouble understanding it. How could siblings who would eventually have to kill each other maintain such a harmonious relationship? If he had been one of the merfolk royals, he would have tried every means to eliminate his brothers and sisters. Conversely, if he judged that he could never be the final victor, he would have fled the kingdom from the start. Yet they continued to regard each other as siblings and got along well, despite clear differences in power and talent. When he said this, the two looked at Turan intently.
What?
I mean, I never really thought about killing them all off first.
Sometimes, I really think your mindset is a little off.
Is that so?
Yeah, really.
Misa and Solif nodded in unison. After finishing their training, Turan's group, tired of eating fish, hunted a beast and prepared a meal using various spices and grain flour brought from Miguel Island. With his hunger satisfied, Turan turned to Misa, who was licking her lips after taking just a single bite.
Let's go replenish your meal.
Okay.
Misa stole a glance at Solif before nodding. Although they had done this numerous times during their time together, she still seemed reluctant to let Solif see the process of this feeding activity, as if it were something as private as using the restroom.
Bring back some water while you're at it.
Solif, aware of this, deliberately acted as if it was nothing special. However, at times his forced indifference only made the situation feel even more awkward. After finishing the feeding process in a secluded part of the forest, Mesa began putting on her magic artifacts again. As she did, Turan finally voiced a thought he had been considering for some time.
After this hunt, we might need Solif's help too.
For what?
For this. If you keep getting stronger, it might become difficult for me to knock you out on my own.
Back when she had been frail and weak, it hadn't been an issue. But as Mesa's health improved, it was becoming increasingly challenging for Turan to make her lose consciousness during the process. Of course, if they had the same amount of magic power, Turan would be stronger due to his superior physical build. However, the problem was that Mesa possessed one of the highest levels of magic power among top-ranking nobles, whereas Turan was on the lower end of that spectrum. On top of that, if she absorbed the great sea serpent's magic power after this hunt, and didn't hit her limit, Misa was the one with the greater potential for further growth. When absorbing magic power from a significantly stronger being, the process was more efficient for those who already had greater power to begin with.
Even now, it's already this difficult. By then, one of us might have to hold your legs while the other knocks you out.
The place where Misa had instinctively struggled earlier was now nothing more than a patch of ground that had been completely churned up. Hearing this, Misa let out a small hum.
That would be a bit.
Really?
Yeah. If it comes to that, I'd rather go hungry for a while. Or I'll try to find another way.
That other way referred to what she had recently discovered, boosting her self-esteem by helping people. If not for the urgent need to hunt the great sea serpent, they had originally planned to roam the North Sea, rescuing merchant ships in distress to fulfill that need. But with the current storm raging, neither merchant ships nor pirate ships were moving around, making it a difficult option.
Then, let's try that method first when the time comes.
All right.
And with that, the two of them had already decided what they would do after the hunt. In other words, it was a silent vow that none of them would die in the battle ahead. As the days passed with alternating cycles of training and rest, the weather on the island grew increasingly violent. The winds strengthened, the rain poured down in torrents, and occasionally thunder rumbled across the sky. Noticing the strange changes in the climate, the island's animals began moving in panicked herds, and even fish in the sea started surfacing in an unusual state. As a result, the previously amicable atmosphere among them gradually turned tense. The realization set in, the great battle was near, and some of them might truly not survive it. Finally, on the fated day, a terrifying storm engulfed the island.
At this rate, we can barely hear each other's voices.
From now on, unless it's urgent, use hand signals to communicate.
Of course, Turan and Misa could transmit their voices using wind magic, and Solif could create floating text with illusion magic. But with every bit of magic power precious for the upcoming fight, they couldn't afford to waste it. Instead, they had prepared and practiced a few simple hand signals in advance. They ran through the signals now, testing range and visibility, checking whether each gesture read clearly through the sheeting rain. The system worked mostly, though distance blurred a few of the finer signs. Just as they were finishing, they spotted Rowena trudging toward them through the mud, clearly frustrated. As she got closer, she practically shouted over the roaring winds.
The king will be here soon. The location is the eastern coast as planned.
Got it.
After relaying the message to the others, Turan stroked BJ to reassure her before moving forward. By the time he arrived, the merfolk royalty had already gathered. The storm tore their words apart before they could carry.
He's finally here. Only a little.
Makun, the merfolk prince who could transform into an octopus, approached and spoke in a low voice.
About 5 minutes left.
Understood.
The plan remains unchanged, right?
We need to make one adjustment.
What is it?
The barrier. It's useless now.
The day before, Turan had poured most of his barrier master bloodline magic into setting up a barrier along the eastern coast, meant to provide some form of support during the battle. But now it was completely scattered, torn apart by the storm. A normal storm wouldn't have been able to do that. However, the great sea serpent had fused with the storm spirit, imbuing it with magical power. Hearing this, the king's eldest son clicked his tongue.
Nothing we can do about it, then. Not like we were relying on it anyway. Anything else?
No. And actually, I think it'll be here sooner than 5 minutes. It's coming right now.
What? Damn, everyone. Prepare for battle.
At Makun's shout, the merfolk royalty began transforming, one by one. Except for a small number, including Rowena, who could operate on land, everyone else submerged into the sea, while the sea turtle lifted Turan and his party onto its back. In that state, Turan took a deep breath while watching the torrent of power approaching from afar.
It's coming?
He sensed a presence, stronger than before, likely the merfolk king, followed by a colossal being trailing behind him, a giant snake that seemed to be made of wind, with its insides constantly swirling. The great sea serpent was approaching. The first thing that became visible was a gigantic humpback whale, roughly 30 to 40 meters, in length the transformed form of the merfolk king. Unlike the other royals, his magic power had become even stronger after his transformation. At this moment, even Misa, a formidable magic user fighting alongside Turan, would have difficulty guaranteeing victory in a one-on-one battle against him. Normally, one would be in awe of the sheer size and power of that enormous whale, but now was not the time for admiration. The presence of the monster approaching from behind was far more overwhelming. The great sea serpent. Back when Turan, the wielder of the mimic relic, had obtained that sacred artifact, he had seen the corpse of a great sea serpent alongside a man presumed to be of the Priya god tribe. He had been astonished by its grand stature. However, the sight of a living, moving great sea serpent now made that past memory seem utterly insignificant. Being in awe of natural landscapes like lakes and mountains was one thing, but witnessing those landscapes come alive, move, and surge forward was an entirely different matter. Moreover, the appearance of the great sea serpent was quite different from what he had seen back then. Unlike in the past, when its body was covered in moss, it was now entirely enveloped in dazzling silver scales. In places where damage had occurred, something akin to swirling greenish winds, presumably created by undead spirits, was filling in the gaps. And finally, there was the immense magic power radiating from its body, which Turan could sense through the sacred relic. Its quantity was on par with what he had once felt from the head of the Lavitas family. That was likely to be the greatest prize of this hunt.
Fucking amazing.
When Turan turned his head, he saw Solif, a companion with a deep fascination for ancient myths and legends, grinning widely as he murmured. Given his obsession with the old stories, the realization that he was about to confront a truly mythical monster seemed to genuinely thrill him.
Let's go.
With that shout, Turan took off into the air alongside Mesa, heading toward the great sea serpent. Solif, slightly behind, grabbed onto BJ's leg, Turan's soul-bonded flying magical beast, and soared up as well, while the merfolk royals approached the great sea serpent through the sea. As they drew closer, the sheer size of their target became even more daunting, sending a shiver down their spines, albeit only briefly. Turan then came to a halt and conjured a wind path. The violent whirlpools swirling in all directions made it more difficult than usual, but he managed to create it nonetheless. With that in place, Turan reached into his pouch and pulled out his secret weapon. It was a slingshot similar in design to the ones he had used before, but its size was on an entirely different scale. The length of the cords and the size of the pouch holding the stone were drastically larger. Whereas his previous slingshot had been designed to launch stones about the size of an egg, this one could accommodate rocks as large as a human torso. Turan placed a large rock he had prepared in advance onto the slingshot and began spinning it. He had no shortage of strength, but throwing a stone of a completely different size than what he had used all his life naturally felt unfamiliar. Though he had trained with it for the past few days, that could not compare to the instincts honed over a lifetime. Thanks to his magic-enhanced strength, the slingshot held firm without breaking, and the massive rock spun smoothly, gaining centrifugal force. Moments later, the rock was released, riding the wind path at a speed several times faster than sound, hurtling toward the great sea serpent's head. A deep, resonant percussion rang out as the projectile found its mark. The monstrous beast, cutting through the sea as it approached the island, twisted its massive body and let out a piercing scream. For a creature of such enormity, it was no different from a human being hit by a pebble. However, the immense magic power contained within the rock amplified its impact far beyond its physical size. Naturally, the great sea serpent's scream did not end as a mere cry of pain from a single animal. The gaping mouth spewed forth a wail, perhaps even a roar, that sent shock waves and tidal waves surging outward. If any ordinary humans had been nearby to hear that sound, they likely would have died from the sheer force of it alone. Even Turan had to furrow his brows and clap both hands over his ears. The great sea serpent, having let out its scream, then locked its bizarrely glowing yellow-green eyes onto Turan and immediately launched a counterattack. A waterspout rose from the sea and several towering columns of water surged erratically before hurtling toward Turan. He swiftly dodged one or two with flight magic, but there were well over a dozen of them flying at him. Considering that flight magic was not structurally the most stable technique, a single direct hit would be enough to send him plummeting. At that critical moment, Turan quickly detonated a handful of the spirit of fire beside his body. With an impact akin to someone striking his side, his body was instantly propelled away, allowing him to escape the range of the water column's attack. He exhaled sharply. One of the water columns that missed Turan struck the coastline of the island behind him, and the result was nothing short of catastrophic. A trench dozens of meters long and several meters deep was carved into the sandy beach. A single hit might not be lethal, but it would undoubtedly cause significant damage. While Turan was distracting the great sea serpent, attacks from other directions had begun.
Ah!
Thanks to the thick storm clouds overhead, Misa could now unleash lightning with virtually no magic consumption. She relentlessly scorched the great sea serpent's entire body, while Solif, hanging from BJ, moved around its massive frame, burning and scraping away its scales with his golden whip. Meanwhile, below, the merfolk royals, who had transformed into various sea creatures, tormented the great sea serpent using their respective specialties, gnawing at its body. Among them, the most striking was undoubtedly the merfolk king in his gigantic whale form. When the massive whale rammed its head into the great sea serpent's side, a thunderous crash echoed like mountains colliding. Turan let out a slow breath of disbelief. Compared to Rowena, whom he had fought recently, the difference in magic power was not tens of times greater or anything like that. Yet the sheer size alone allowed for such overwhelming force it was astonishing. Then again, even if the whale's total length was not even half that of the great sea serpent, its body was far thicker. In terms of overall weight, there probably was not much of a difference. Perhaps thinking that its tormentors in the sea were easier to grasp than those flying in the sky, the great sea serpent let out a roar and coiled its long body around the whale. A jellyfish, which had latched onto the serpent's scales and was discharging electricity in an attempt to break free, was struck by its tail and instantly crushed. One of the merfolk royals dead. At the sight of the first casualty, the remaining royals visibly hesitated. When the great sea serpent opened its massive maw to bite into the whale's side, Turan rushed closer, hurling the spirit of fire directly at its face before igniting it. However, contrary to his expectations, there was no grand explosion. The black powder had been caught in the storm and soaked with moisture. While he could prevent the powder from getting wet if it remained close to his body, keeping it dry after launching it a distance away was much more difficult.
Damn it.
He had known that the spirit of fire lost much of its explosive power upon contact with water, but he had not expected it to fail completely. Though momentarily flustered by the unexpected outcome, Turan quickly erased the failed tactic from his mind and instead hurled a stone at the serpent's enormous fixed eye, which was locked onto the whale's side. Due to the urgency of the moment, he did not use the massive rocks he had thrown earlier, but rather the smaller stones he was accustomed to using. To a creature of such colossal size, the attack was barely a speck. However, just like any human reacting to an eye being struck, the great sea serpent twisted its entire body violently, thrashing its tail against the ocean's surface. Dozens, no, perhaps hundreds, of water columns erupted simultaneously, churning the sea across hundreds of meters in every direction.
Watch out.
Turan quickly used wind magic to project his voice, but Solif and BJ, who had been flying around tearing into the serpent's body, had not yet managed to escape the attack range. Through the raging storm, he barely glimpsed the two staggering in midair before they were ultimately engulfed by one of the water columns and dragged down into the ocean. The one fortunate thing was that, thanks to the mimic relic, Turan could maintain his vision even amid the raging storm. Flying in immediately, he saw Solif manipulating the water to propel himself out of the sea.
You okay?
I am, but BJ's wing looks broken.
Turan grabbed both BJ and Solif and carried them to the coastline of the island behind them. Solif looked at BJ, who was whimpering in pain, and spoke in a self-reproaching tone.
Damn it. If it weren't for me, she would have dodged easily.
One of the chronic weaknesses of flying magical beasts was that their physical durability was often lower relative to their magic power. Of course, as a high-tier magical beast, BJ could withstand most attacks without much trouble, but the enemy before them was literally a monster of mythical proportions. Even now it was thanks to the magic artifact Turan had obtained from the remnants of House Varaha and tied around BJ's neck that she had not suffered a more serious injury or even died. Turan carefully adjusted BJ's broken wing and gave her a healing potion.
Are you feeling any better, BJ?
BJ nodded as if to say she was fine, but through their soul bond, Turan could still sense the pain she was experiencing. Considering that flight required an immense level of precision, and that a wild storm was raging all around them, it would be difficult for her to rejoin the battle immediately. After instructing BJ to stay further inside the island, Turan placed Solif on the back of a nearby sea turtle, merfolk. Though it would be difficult to approach the battle directly, providing support from a distance would still be helpful. Upon returning to the battlefield, where the struggle against the great sea serpent continued, Turan frowned at the worsening situation. Though only a short time had passed, 2 more merfolk royals had died, and the giant whale was now bleeding from multiple wounds.
Are they okay?
Misa called out through wind magic. She had apparently seen BJ and Solif get struck down. Turan signaled that they were fine before pulling out another massive rock, creating a wind path and hurling it. With a loud crash, the great sea serpent staggered. The problem was that the merfolk royals had started to become noticeably passive. Unlike Turan's group who attacked from the sky, the merfolk were in the water, right within the great sea serpent's striking range. It naturally prioritized them as targets. Having suffered significant casualties, the merfolk royals were now retreating rather than fighting aggressively. Turan was sure they were thinking the same thing he was. If they suffered too many losses and the balance of power shifted, Turan's group might decide to eliminate them after the battle. With 3 of their own already dead, the merfolk royals would not be willing to take further risks, unless Turan's group also faced similar dangers or casualties. No choice then. Turan placed a large rock into his slingshot and began spinning it while flying around the great sea serpent's head to draw its attention. Just like before, the serpent attempted to create whirlpools to swat him down like an annoying insect. But every time, Turan used the spirit of fire to propel himself away at high speed. narrowly avoiding the attacks. After repeating this process multiple times, his entire body ached as if he had been beaten all over. It was brutal, but his efforts were not in vain. Seeing his relentless assault, the merfolk royals, who had become passive, once again took on an aggressive stance. From a distance, Solif also fired arrows of light and conjured spears to hurl at the great sea serpent, further drawing its attention. As for Mesa, for some reason, she had switched from using lightning to employing physical light-based attack magic, similar to Solif. Perhaps she had realized that lightning magic was not as effective against the great sea serpent as she had initially thought. Thus, the fierce battle continued for tens of minutes. Turan realized that his magic power had visibly decreased and took a step back to steady his breathing. Seeing this, Mesa stepped in to take over the role of distracting the great sea serpent, just as Turan had been doing. According to the sacred relic's perception, the great sea serpent's magic power had dropped to less than half of its original amount. Its body, too, had been severely damaged, with many parts now replaced by the swirling storms typical of undead spirits. While undead were structurally far more resilient than living creatures, they were not truly immortal, meaning the damage was taking its toll. The problem was that Turan's group and the merfolk royals were also just as drained. Among the 9 merfolk royals who had originally joined the battle, 3 had already died, and within Turan's party, BJ had been rendered unable to fight, while Solif was struggling to participate actively. Considering how precariously balanced the situation was, a single misstep could easily turn the tide of battle against them. The thought of giving up briefly crossed Turan's mind, but he shook his head and dismissed it. They had come too far to abandon the fight now. Victory seemed just within reach, if they could push a little further. If only it weren't for this storm. If he could launch a large quantity of spirit of fire from a distance and detonate it, the battle would have been much smoother. Using the slingshot as a medium for attacks was already an effective way to conserve magic power, but it still fell short of the sheer destructive force of an explosive attack with the spirit of fire. If he could either stop the storm or somehow enclose the spirit of fire inside or onto the surface of the great sea serpent without exposing it to the wind and rain, he might be able to deal a significant blow. In fact, if he could trap the explosion in a confined space, the force would be amplified even further. As he pondered, a sudden realization struck Turan like a bolt of lightning. His eyes went wide. The slingshot's pouch protected from the rain, and when the spirit of fire detonated, it created a powerful repulsive force. At the same time, he recalled the old magic artifact used by dwarves, a device that shot metal fragments using the principle of liquid expanding into vapor. What if he applied the same concept to launch a rock using spirit of fire? If he filled the inside of the slingshot pouch with spirit of fire, placed a rock on top, and detonated it at the moment of launch, the idea struck him in an instant. Without hesitation, Turan grabbed several handfuls of spirit of fire and placed them inside his large slingshot. Then he placed a massive rock on top to shield the spirit of fire from the falling rain, fixing its shape in place with telekinesis magic before soaring into the sky. A faint vibration seemed to ripple through the storm, as if the great sea serpent had sensed him return. It had grown familiar with his face after being struck several times, and now it glared at Turan with open hostility, momentarily ignoring Misa, who had been provoking it nearby. It knew that he was the one who had dealt it the most painful blows. Meanwhile, the merfolk royals fighting below were visibly encouraged by Turan's return to the battlefield. If the merfolk king, who had withstood the great sea serpent's charges time and again, was their greatest defender, then Turan, who had repeatedly struck its head with massive boulders, was their strongest attacker. Seeing the great sea serpent warily eyeing him, Turan smirked. Then, in one fluid motion, he launched the rock and detonated the spirit of fire at the same moment. A wave of scorching heat brushed against his hand as the boulder shot forward, faster and more powerful than ever before. Its target, the great sea serpent's head, the very spot where the previous owner of the mimic relic had once driven his hand.
Get away.
The merfolk king used the immense lung capacity unique to whales to shout, his voice booming through the storm. Watching his children hurriedly retreat, the king recalled the terrifying attack from a moment ago. What in the world was that just now? Though he had only lived within the sea and around his kingdom, the merfolk king had lived a long life, inheriting the wisdom of his ancestors, making his knowledge far superior to that of ordinary merfolk. From his perspective, the slingshot attack that Turan had just performed was not something that should have come from a wizard of his level. It was the kind of power seen only in the strongest of human wizards, the wizard lords, those whom humans referred to as family heads of great noble houses. Considering that Turan's power had not seemed that formidable just moments before, the sheer destructive force he had displayed now was far from normal. As expected, he must be one of the Undying Ones. The king, who had harbored some doubts due to Turan's initially weaker strength, now solidified his belief. Swallowing his thoughts, he focused on protecting his children from the thrashing of the great sea serpent. A cascade of warning pulses rippled outward from the beast, and then the monster moved. The sheer force generated by the over 100-meter-long monster's convulsions was overwhelming. Its massive body stirred the air and water violently, causing tsunamis with each movement. From the wound inflicted by Turan's attack, an enormous gust of wind burst forth, creating a magical storm. A giant octopus, its body alone over 8 meters wide, was half floating above the water when it was caught in the storm and flung hundreds of meters away.
Get in my mouth. Hurry.
Turan saw Solif, who had been attacking from the shell of the sea turtle, quickly dive into the turtle's mouth for safety. He then used tracking magic to locate BJ. The surrounding tidal waves and storms had already reached the island, completely sweeping away the once pristine beach and even devastating the forest behind it. Fortunately, it seemed that the destruction had not reached the inner area where BJ was. Turan let out a slow breath of relief and tossed aside his slingshot, now tattered from the explosion. Normally, he would reinforce the slingshot with magic when throwing stones, but it seemed it had not been enough to withstand the explosion. Now that he looked at it, his hand was injured too. His fingers burned and had developed blisters. He had sustained burns from the explosion. Considering that he had not even activated his guardian magic artifact to conserve magic power, it was fortunate that this was the extent of his injuries. As he debated whether to take some healing medicine, Misa approached and asked,
"What was that just now?"
I used the Spirit of Fire. I'll explain the details later.
In truth, it had been a spur-of-the-moment idea that he immediately put into action, and he had thought there was a high chance of failure. However, for some reason, it had worked as if he had practiced it hundreds of times before. He had felt something similar in the past when throwing stones. A sensation that only came in critical moments, the absolute certainty that he could hit his target. It might have been the result of Turan's years of relentless training and honed intuition, and just now he had not even used magic to guide the rock to its target, as he had been focused on using wind path. More than that, if he refined this technique, it could be incredibly useful. Even just in his immediate thoughts, several possible applications came to mind. After filling a large pouch with hundreds of pebbles and the Spirit of Fire, he could throw it into the midst of enemies and detonate it. Or he could use it as the dwarves once did, loading a long, slender tube with metal fragments, placing the Spirit of Fire at the back, and igniting it to launch a projectile. As his imagination ran wild with possibilities, the great sea serpent's thrashing began to subside. Was it truly on the verge of death now? Turan was not the only one who thought so. The massive octopus that had been blown away earlier by the wind approached and lifted one of its tentacles toward the great sea serpent. At that moment, something changed within the half-dead monster.
Get away,
Turan shouted urgently, but the two were already too close. The great sea serpent, which had been wheezing as if it were about to take its last breath, suddenly opened its eyes wide and burst into a green radiance. The storm spirit that had been inside its body just moments ago escaped somewhere, fully transforming into an undead spirit. Though it was still on the brink of death, its battered body now seemed to have gained a final surge of power. It opened its maw toward the octopus, gathering magic energy inside. What erupted from its mouth was a golden flash, and the massive octopus's body melted away as if a red-hot blade had passed through butter. Light of judgment. Seeing the secret magic of the sun bloodline, one that the Varaha took pride in, pouring from the great sea serpent's mouth, Turan momentarily lost his words. How in the world was that thing able to use it? As if mocking his confusion, the great sea serpent soon unleashed a massive surge of lightning from its entire body, targeting not only the mermaid royal family nearby, but also Turan and Mesa, who were flying in the sky. It was not difficult to deduce that it was returning the lightning attacks that Mesa had been relentlessly striking it with earlier. Turan narrowly avoided the lightning by detonating a handful of the Spirit of Fire to propel himself away, but Mesa was struck. With a scream, she fell straight into the sea. Turan initially moved to save her, but stopped upon realizing that the great sea serpent had locked onto him. Unlike him, Misa had fully awakened her storm bloodline, granting her high resistance to electricity. He could only trust that she would survive. Mimic. The first word that came to Turan's mind as he dodged the relentless bolts of lightning was exactly that. Nowhere in the ancient records he had obtained from the library did it mention that the great sea serpent had such an ability. Unlike his own mimic relic, which allowed him to steal and wield the powers of those he killed, this creature seemed to be replicating any ability it had been struck with. Had it been in contact with the mimic god, causing its undead spirit to become intertwined with his? Judging by the fact that it had used Solif's power once but did not use it again, there seemed to be some limitation. However, even with such restrictions, the situation was far from optimistic. Misa had been unleashing an immense lightning storm since the start of the battle, the kind only the family head of House Aravion would normally be capable of. If the great sea serpent were to return all that power at once, it could kill everyone here twice over. As Turan evaded the lightning while contemplating their next move, he suddenly realized that the storm raging around them was fading. It seemed that with the storm's spirit gone, the great sea serpent had lost its ability to control the weather. Moreover, the merfolk royals who had been forced to retreat earlier due to the lightning storm, as well as Mesa and Solif who had fallen into the sea, were now approaching from underwater, drawing its attention with their attacks. Since lightning spreads rapidly in water and loses its concentrated power, they were likely trying to exploit that weakness. However, considering the sheer strength of the great sea serpent's physical body, a single direct hit from it could instantly kill them. It was a reckless gamble. In that case, there was no way Turan could waste the precious opportunity his allies had created. Unfortunately, his large slingshot had been torn apart by the explosion, making it impossible to use the same technique as before. However, now that the storm had cleared, he could employ the previously abandoned strategy. Turan, who had been soaring through the sky, suddenly vanished as if erased. Breathing through a water-controlled air tube, Solif cursed at the sheer majesty of the mythical beast before him. Just moments ago, the creature had swatted him away as if shaking off a bothersome fly, sending him tumbling back dozens of meters due to the waves it created. If the great sea serpent had deliberately targeted him, he would not have lasted long. His mastery of fluid manipulation magic was still lacking, making him far from agile underwater. But swallowing his fear, Solif conjured a spear of light within the water and hurled it toward the great sea serpent's belly and chest. Having been trained in spear throwing for decades as the heir of Varaha, his skill remained effective even underwater. The attack had enough magic power imbued in it to cause a sting. The great sea serpent opened its now fully green-tinted eyes wide and glared at him. In other words, that was all it amounted to. From earlier, he knew that his specialty, Light of Judgment, was strong enough to tear through its scales and flesh. But if he tried to get close enough to land a decisive hit, he would undoubtedly lose his life. Moreover, for some reason, the creature had mimicked his technique earlier, making him even more hesitant to attempt it again. The moment he hurriedly dodged in anticipation of a counterattack, a massive tail swept through the spot where he had just been, creating a powerful whirlpool. His air passage above the water vanished, and within seconds seawater flooded into his mouth. Gasping and choking on the briny water instead of air, Solif desperately swam toward the surface, using both his magic and physical strength. Luckily, Rowena, passing by, grabbed him with her pincers and pulled him up, allowing him to surface much faster.
Thanks.
Where's your leader?
Rowena asked.
He was just here, but now he's gone.
Still gasping for breath as he emerged from the water, Solif turned his gaze to the sky at her words. Indeed, Turan, who had been flying around moments ago drawing the enemy's attention, was nowhere to be seen. Had he finally been struck down by the lightning magic? Or had he found it impossible to dodge and escaped into the water as they had? Perhaps he was with Misa? Solif checked. But that was not the case either. Misa was still submerged near the great sea serpent, continuously shooting arrows of light. She seemed to be moving far more skillfully than him, but she was getting dangerously close to the target. Should I tell her to back off? Not that she'd be able to see my hand signals from here. Just as he was thinking that, an explosion erupted from the top of the great sea serpent's head, and Solif's eyes went wide. A torrent of system pulses flooded the air around the beast, each one deeper and more urgent than the last. This is definitely its weak point. Turan, having absorbed the magic power of the Sun bloodline he had obtained from Varaha nobles in the past, particularly the power of the strongest one, used concealment magic to approach the very same vital point that his rock had pierced earlier. Normally, even with Zahar's concealment magic, it would have been difficult to attempt such a feat, as the constantly moving head posed a significant risk of accidental contact. However, the creature had slowed down from exhaustion, and was also distracted by the attackers in the water, allowing him to get close. With that opening, Turan poured a large amount of spirit of fire into the wound. The cavity where the drowned god's arm had once been embedded, now widened further by his earlier rock attack, before pulling back and igniting it. The resulting hole was now large enough for a person to pass through. Jumping inside and activating the light of judgment, he wildly swung the whip of light to erase the essence of the undead spirit. The great sea serpent screamed as if it were about to die and twisted its body violently. A natural reaction, this was the equivalent of gouging its brain if it were a living being. Yes, that hurts, doesn't it? Bracing himself within the relatively narrow cavity inside its skull, Turan wedged his foot into a groove to keep from being thrown around as he relentlessly lashed with the light whip. With every crack of the whip, the undead's green glow burned away, causing the great sea serpent's screams and convulsions to intensify. Then a voice came from somewhere.
No.
Turan instinctively knew that the voice belonged to the entity that had fused with the great sea serpent, the mimic god.
Die.
Who was supposed to die? Turan, the one threatening its existence. The answer came immediately.
For the sake of people, serpent, die.
That was the will carried by the undead spirit of the mimic god, the remnants of a desperate longing it must have held onto until the moment of its death. How tragic it was that the spirit of a god who had once fought against the great sea serpent for humanity had now merged with its old enemy. Determined to put an end to this misguided devotion, Turan squeezed out the last of his remaining magic power, relentlessly erasing the green glow that filled the cavity where the brain should have been with light of judgment. The acrid stench of burning undead essence filled his nostrils, and his body was repeatedly slammed against the shaking walls of the skull. After several minutes passed, the tremors inside the skull ceased at last, and the massive body began to plummet freely. Turan could sense it. The fusion between the great sea serpent and the god's undead spirit had been completely shattered. The magic that had been controlling the enormous serpent's body was now condensing into a single point.
Thank you.
The words came faintly, barely more than a breath. Turan slightly bowed his head.
Rest in peace. I owe you a lot.
The god likely could not hear him, but this was the best show of respect Turan could offer. A moment later, the sound of rushing water filled the skull as it began to flood. Without hesitation, Turan submerged himself and swam out. As soon as he was free, the mimic relic's previously blocked perception reactivated, revealing the presence of the nearby life forms. The merfolk king and his royal kin, Solif, Mesa. Spotting two figures atop the shell of a sea turtle, Turan urgently cast flight magic and soared toward them.
Turan, healing potion quickly.
Solif shouted with a frantic expression. Below him, Mesa lay pale-faced, her lower body nowhere to be seen. A missing lower half, an injury so severe that had she not been a high-ranking noble, she would have already died. Without hesitation, Turan pulled out a healing potion magic artifact and handed it to Solif before turning away.
Where are you going?
To get her body.
Fortunately, the severed half of Misa's body had not drifted out of range of the mimic relic's detection. Turan dove swiftly, retrieved the lower half, and resurfaced. At the same time, he scanned the condition of the merfolk royals. They were all severely injured, and some had died, but it would be dangerous to use all his magic power here. No matter how weakened they were, it would not be difficult for a merfolk noble to kill a magic-depleted human if they could transform into their true sea creature forms. In practical terms, only one of them could afford to use magic for healing, while the other had to conserve what little strength remained. The problem was that if they chose to hold back, there was a high chance Mesa would die. The healing potion magic artifact was not particularly effective for mages of their caliber, and even if they both poured all their remaining magic into healing her, there was no guarantee of survival. After a brief moment of deliberation, Turan quickly approached Solif, who was administering the potion, and spoke.
Lift her upper body. I'll align the halves.
Can it be reattached?
At least it's not burned or melted like your arm was. What exactly happened?
I think she got caught on something. When the thing made its last desperate attack, I thought she was too close.
Solif's severed arm had been burned away by light of judgment, making it impossible to restore. But Misa's body had been torn apart relatively cleanly, giving them a chance. Should he be shocked by the sheer physical combat ability of that monster, powerful enough to shatter multiple high-tier magic artifacts protecting her body? Or should he be grateful for Misa's resilience, which had allowed her to survive such an impact without being completely crushed? After asking the sea turtle to take them to land, Turan and Solif took turns preparing healing potions to treat Misa. He even hurriedly called BJ, who had been further inland, and poured all their remaining magic power into the effort. Only after nearly 20 minutes did they finally manage to stabilize her condition.
It's done. She'll recover naturally over time now.
She's alive.
Solif, already half exhausted, collapsed onto the ground the moment he heard those words. Turan briefly checked BJ's wings to make sure they had reattached correctly, before examining Maisa's condition. Though she was still unconscious with a pale complexion, warm blood was now circulating through her reattached lower half. From what Turan could perceive through the mimic relic, it was clear that if he and BJ hadn't both poured in their magic, her body wouldn't have properly fused, and she would have died. He let out a slow breath. Just as he did, several shadows loomed over him and Solif. It was the merfolk king and a few of his royal kin. Their numbers had decreased compared to when the battle first began, and they looked at Turan's group with unreadable expressions. The merfolk king observed them closely before speaking.
You've been badly injured.
Unfortunately. But we managed to get through it.
Turan replied in a calm, almost indifferent tone while discreetly observing the merfolk's expressions. If they decided to turn hostile here, there was no way Turan's group would survive. The magic power left in his body was so depleted that even if Armania were to attack in his shark form, dealing with him would be difficult. After a few tense seconds of silence, the merfolk king spoke in a low voice.
Let me know if you need any help. We want to recover the corpse quickly, so absorb the power as soon as that woman wakes up. For now, we'll bring it to the beach.
As the merfolk left, Turan, just like Solif moments ago, let himself collapse onto the sand. A few hours after losing consciousness as if fainting, Turan woke to someone tapping his cheek. Bija, his avian magical beast companion, was carefully poking him with her beak.
BJ.
She lifted a stone tablet from the large capacity pouch, where she had pre-written the words.
Does it hurt a lot?
Seeing this, Turan unknowingly burst into laughter.
Not too much, just a little.
He winced as he tried to sit up, a stinging pain spreading all over his body, as if he had been severely beaten. Not only had he repeatedly used high-speed movement by exploding the spirit of fire beside his body dozens of times, but at the end, he had also violently slammed his entire body against the walls inside the great sea serpent's skull. There was no way he could be unharmed. He hadn't noticed while fighting, not with the adrenaline still running hot, but he must have sprained quite a few places. It was going to take a while to heal on its own. Of course, if he consistently took the healing potion magic artifact, he would recover in no time. But before that, he needed to treat the serious injuries of his other companions first.
How are your wings?
The tablet answered.
They're fine.
Can you fly?
At Turan's concerned words, BJ attempted a quick spin in the air, then let out a sharp cry and landed immediately.
Take it easy. I'll look at your wound again later.
The tablet read simply.
Okay.
After that, Turan woke his two unconscious companions one by one. Solif, who was only exhausted from excessive magic power consumption and fatigue like himself, woke up quickly. However, it took quite a bit of time for Maisa to open her eyes.
Where are we?
Maisa murmured.
We're still on the same island.
Turan said.
How do you feel?
I thought I was dead.
You almost were.
Recalling how her lower body had been completely severed at the last moment, Maisa looked down with a somewhat fearful expression. Then, seeing her intact legs, she let out a sigh of relief.
Thank goodness.
Let me check your wound for a moment.
Okay.
The defensive magic artifacts Maisa used, including her favorite coat, had all lost their power. It was a huge loss, but considering that those items had saved her life, it was a small price to pay. After all, no matter what, a lost life could never be recovered. Carefully lifting the torn clothing, Turan found a long scar encircling her body just below her navel. Seeing this, Solif clicked his tongue.
Wow, it's a miracle you're alive. Didn't we just patch the cut without properly reconnecting the internal organs?
That's actually what I'm worried about,
Turan said.
Try moving a bit? I checked that blood is flowing, but I don't know if you can walk.
Maisa tested herself.
Yeah, I can't move it at all.
After lightly poking and pinching several spots, they confirmed that Maisa's lower body was only attached but completely non-functional. It seemed the nerves hadn't healed properly during the recovery process. Even after making her drink another healing potion, there was no sign of improvement. The wound had been sealed, but fundamental healing required a stronger recovery ability.
I wonder if we should call that girl who fixed me back then? Even at her level, it would take quite a while, though.
It's fine. I can move using flight magic anyway.
To prove her words, Misa immediately used levitations and flight magic to lift herself and glided smoothly over the ground. Indeed, having used these abilities far longer than Turan, her proficiency was exceptional.
If I practice a bit, I might even be able to mimic walking.
But you can't live like that forever,
Turan said.
And there could be problems with your internal organs, so we need to find a way to heal you quickly.
Turan had Mesa sit down and carefully examine the wound. Perhaps because a lower-tier healing potion had been used, The joined area didn't feel very secure. It felt like a broken mass that had been forcibly patched together. Since he couldn't be sure her internal organs had fully reattached either, they needed to find a treatment as soon as possible.
In that case, we need to absorb the great sea serpent's corpse first. Speaking of which, what happened to it?
They said they'd bring it to the beach.
Mesa said.
I just woke up, so I haven't seen it yet.
Let's go quickly.
Solif's voice rose with urgency.
If some passing magical beast eats it, I'll be so pissed I might just die from anger.
Turan lightly waved his hand to stop Solif from making a fuss.
It's fine. The merfolk are guarding it.
Really?
From about a few hundred meters away on the beach, Turan could sense the concentrated energy of the great sea serpent's remains and the presence of a merfolk nearby. It was just one merfolk, but in the middle of the North Sea, the chances of an enemy appearing who could rival a royal merfolk were almost non-existent.
They need the corpse anyway. More than that, I'm worried that if Misa absorbs more magic power, it will become even harder for her to recover.
She was already too powerful for healing potions to work effectively. If she absorbed the magic power of the great sea serpent and became even stronger, she might truly be unable to heal without the help of a high-level healer.
You don't need to worry about me,
Misa said with a calm smile.
It's not like I'm going to die right away. Besides, if a revived undead spirit's magic power isn't absorbed quickly, it scatters and disappears, right? After all that effort, we deserve a reward.
After finishing their discussion, the three of them moved straight to the eastern shore. The area, which had been completely devastated by the great sea serpent's final cries, was now eerily still, with the corpse of the once revered sea monster lying motionless.
I can't believe we actually killed something like this,
Solif murmured.
Even seeing it, it doesn't feel real.
Misa agreed. Turan silently agreed with them. The great sea serpent's body, now lifeless for the second time, looked similar to when they had first seen it in the ocean, but facing it again after having fought it themselves made the sight all the more overwhelming. At that moment, someone who had been sitting atop the serpent's head leaped down and approached them.
What? You're finally awake. Looks like even powerful humans get weak when they're exhausted.
It was Kolova, a young merfolk royal, the sea turtle who had once gotten scolded for speaking too carelessly.
It was a fierce battle, after all,
Turan said.
Where are the other merfolk?
They're all resting in the nearby waters. It's better for us to be inside when we're exhausted. Since I'm the only one still fine, I'm the one stuck out here. Hurry up and absorb that magic power. I'll go fetch my father.
At the prince's clearly annoyed tone, Turan nodded and turned to his companions. He could see the anticipation and desire in their eyes.
All right, let's begin.
Yeah.
Approaching the massive corpse of the great sea serpent, the three of them and one magical beast immediately began absorbing its magic power. A vast amount of green energy surged out and seeped into their bodies. Then Turan noticed that a portion of the magic power was flowing into the mimic relic. Normally, a magical beast's magic power wouldn't be absorbed into an artifact while it was being worn. Could it be because of the spirit of the god that was mixed into it? Realizing this, Turan quickly tried to take off the relic. The most efficient number for magic absorption was 4. If this continued, not only he but also Solif, Mesa, and BJ would receive less magic power. However, Misa and Solif, standing nearby, grabbed his hand to stop him.
Why?
Just leave it be.
There might be some beneficial effect.
Their reasoning was that if the divine magic power from the artifact's origin was infused, it could result in some kind of positive influence. If it was just absorbing the Wave Rider and Mimic's magic power, it would be a meaningless loss. Turan was about to argue, but before he could, an immense impact struck his mind, and he lost his chance to respond. He let out a sharp grunt. Around him the others gasped and groaned. The great sea serpent's magic power delivered an indescribable sensation, one beyond anything of this world. It felt as if his bones, muscles, flesh, and nerves were burning away, only to be reconstructed anew. Compared to this, all the magic absorption he had experienced before was nothing more than child's play. Originally, Turan's magic power had been on the lower end among the highest-ranking nobles, but in an instant it surpassed the mid-tier level of someone like Solif, climbed into the upper tier, and finally reached the absolute peak, matching Misa's level at the highest of the high ranks. Just like when his bloodline had been unlocked in the past, he heard a metallic clank, as if something had reached its limit and then broken free. Even after that, Turan's magic power continued to rise, eventually surpassing Misa's and reaching a level somewhere between the highest-ranking nobles and the heads of great noble houses. Only then did his growth finally stop. Turan wiped the drool from the corner of his mouth and turned his gaze to his companions. Solif clenched and unclenched his fists as if unable to contain the overflowing power within him. Meanwhile, Mysa had collapsed to the ground, unable to maintain her flight magic. Both of them had grown beyond their previous limits, reaching a realm far beyond that of ordinary high nobles. Mysa was now strong enough to at least put up some defense against Ozul Lavitas, the weakest head of a great noble house that Turan had encountered. Solif was slightly weaker than her, but still stronger than Turan. Turan had been worried that one of them might hit their limit during the process. However, as expected of those chosen as vessels of the gods, they seemed to have the potential to grow into house-head-level figures. BJ's stone tablet came flying into view, the words scrawled with unmistakable excitement. Turan, Turan, I felt amazing, so much. Even she had undergone rapid growth in just a short time. Now, BJ possessed the magic power of a highest-ranking noble, similar to the heirs of great noble houses, just like Turan had before this battle. If a magical beast with this much power appeared, people would undoubtedly declare it a mythical class beast and panic. Ordinary noble families would have no means to deal with it, and would have to summon the armies of great houses. At this level, Turan thought, he might even be able to fight against Aravion, the mighty Thunder Lord. He still wasn't confident he could defeat him, but at the very least he had reached a point where ordinary nobles who weren't possessed by gods felt like mere weaklings. He only had a brief moment to enjoy that realization, before noticing a change within his two companions. Turan observed them carefully.
Why are you looking at us like that?
Mysa asked.
Both of your symbols have changed.
One of them drew a sharp breath.
What?
Did you hear any sound from your body?
A sound?
Solif rubbed the back of his neck.
Now that you mention it, I heard a sharp snap, like a tree branch breaking.
For me, it was the sound of glass shattering,
Mysa said. Solif, who originally had a glowing white hand and a fireball as his symbol, now had a shield added to it, the symbol of the guardian bloodline, something Turan had seen before from his old martial arts teacher, Haram. As for Mysa, next to her storm clouds, a white anvil and a black hammer had appeared, the symbols of the enchanter bloodline. If a clenched fist were to grasp and swing those, it would likely show power similar to what he had seen from the head of House Aravion in the past. When he pointed this out, both of them looked visibly shocked.
Enchanter? Me?
Mysa's voice was tight.
I have the guardian bloodline.
Solif crossed his arms.
But I have nothing to do with it.
It's one of the 4 bloodlines of the Silver Sun.
Turan said.
Maybe it's some secret about your birth.
You bastard. Don't just go talking nonsense about my parents.
Solif grumbled, but he didn't outright deny the possibility. Unlike Mysa, who was the daughter of a househead, Solif was born to an ordinary noble couple, making it easier for his origins to have been manipulated. While Mysa used a magic spell to check the functions of her lost magic artifacts and Solif knocked on his own chest to test his newfound durability, Turan raised a hand toward the sky, now completely clear of clouds due to the disappearance of the storm spirit. A single bolt of lightning cracked into the ocean, sending a deafening boom rolling across the air. The storm bloodline was complete. Normally, summoning such powerful lightning from a clear sky would require an immense amount of energy. Yet now, the amount of magic power Turan used felt no different from calling lightning on a stormy day. Not only that, but he could precisely control the strike down to a matter of centimeters. At last, he had fully awakened the final bloodline magic of lightning. As Turan continued practicing various applications of his new power, wrapping his body in lightning as a protective barrier, shaping it into a serpent to move at his command, Mysa noticed and called over.
You finally foremassed lightning too?
Yeah, it's definitely convenient. I can see why Aravian wizards don't bother learning multiple attack spells.
Compared to wind magic, which was notoriously difficult to use for direct attacks, lightning magic was absurdly powerful and straightforward. Its only drawback was that, like fire magic, it was weak against defenses created through earth-altering magic, and on top of that, it was ineffective against enemies submerged in water.
So, did you all check your abilities?
Turan asked.
Yeah.
Mysa said.
I can use enchantment magic now. It's something I've never practiced before, so I'll need some training to use it properly.
You can contact Ashiz later and ask him for some tips. Solif, what about you?
For starters, my strength has increased like crazy. Want to see?
Without waiting for an answer, Solif gripped Turan's hand and pulled, and Turan's entire body was effortlessly dragged toward him without resistance. Turan steadied himself and looked down at his own arm.
Amazing, right?
Solif grinned. Solif had always been small but solidly built with strong magic power, making him naturally a bit stronger than Turan, but the sheer difference in strength was far beyond what it had ever been before.
I still need to test my defensive abilities more, but yeah, I'm sure it's improved a lot.
Originally, Solif already had the exceptional offensive power of the Sun bloodline. Now, with the addition of the Guardian bloodline, he had gained defensive prowess and close combat capabilities. In terms of pure offense and defense, he was undoubtedly the strongest among them. Now, his only real weakness was mobility and support, or rather, his complete lack of them. In this battle alone, he had been unable to fly, forcing him to take on a support role in the rear after BJ was injured.
I wish I had gotten something like that, instead of the Enchanter bloodline,
Mesa muttered, then abruptly shut her mouth. She seemed to realize that complaining about her new power was disrespectful to the mother who had passed it down to her. Their conversation about their newfound abilities was short-lived. Soon after, they sensed multiple presences rising from the sea. Moments later, the merfolk, led by their king, surfaced en masse.
Kind-hearted devil, you survived.
It was Armania, a young merfolk royal.
Yeah, I made it.
Turan greeted Armania, who beamed at him, and casually scanned the gathered royal merfolk. The absence of several members was noticeable, particularly the octopus Makun, the king's eldest son, and a few others who had perished. Turan did not feel particularly regretful about their absence. When he had first staggered onto the island, exhausted and barely alive, the merfolk king's gaze had been unmistakably calculating, measuring him. If their forces had remained intact, and if Turan hadn't planted the suspicion that he was a vessel of some god, he and his companions might have been slaughtered right then and there. Now the merfolk king pressed down on Armenia's head and spoke with his usual stoic expression.
So, have you finished harvesting?
More or less.
Then it's time for us to take our share.
Turan carefully assessed the strength of the merfolk king and the royal merfolk, then weighed it against the abilities of his own group. None of them were in perfect condition, but they had all grown significantly stronger than before, while the merfolk, in contrast, had weakened. If a battle were to break out here, victory was certain. However,
as promised, I'll yield the corpse to you.
The merfolk king gave him a probing look, as if testing him, but in the end did not attack.
Fair enough.
Their agreement remained intact. Besides, allowing them to absorb the great sea serpent's power could work in their favor in the long run. Led by an enormous whale, the royals transformed into various large sea creatures and began dragging the great sea serpent's corpse from the beach into the ocean. Lastly, the young shark Armenia waved a fin in farewell before disappearing beneath the waves.
Whew, it's really over now.
More importantly, how are we going to leave this island?
Misa cut in.
The ship got wrecked during the fight, and BJ's wings aren't in the best shape either. Maybe we should have asked them to drop us off at the nearest island?
BJ isn't too badly injured. If she keeps taking the healing potion, she'll recover soon.
BJ flapped her wings as if to reassure them, then let out a small chirp when the broken part throbbed with pain. Turan patted the whimpering creature, and as he did, Misa spoke up.
By the way, what happened to it? The sacred relic.
Solif straightened.
Oh, right. I completely forgot. I hope it was worth sharing our magic power with it.
Urged by his companions, Turan quickly retrieved the sacred relic hanging from his chest. At first glance it looked unchanged, but as he pressed the protrusion to open the lid, his voice caught.
What is it?
A companion asked.
The inside, it's different.